Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Hello and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Anthony Murnau. It's great to be with you. On the program, we talk about legislation that passed through the New Mexico legislature this year, as well as issues that still face the state. Joining us for the program is Think New Mexico founder and executive director, Fred Nathan. Fred, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now let's start off by talking about your think tank. Can you share with our audience a little bit about the mission of Think New Mexico?
Sure. Think New Mexico is a results-oriented think tank serving New Mexicans. We're a little bit different than most think tanks that tend to be either way over on the left or way over on the right, and we just believe in a state that's 49th or 50th in too many of these national rankings, that the focus really ought to be on solutions rather than political ideology. And consistent with that, we've got a board of directors made up of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Your viewers will know many of them. They're statesmen and stateswomen. So for example, we have a former Republican Governor, Gary Carruthers. We have a former Democratic First Lady, Claire Apodaca, and just a group of statesmen and stateswomen. We're best known for getting a full-day kindergarten law through the legislature and repealing the food tax, and this last year getting the tax mostly off of Social Security and also ending predatory lending.
Okay, let's start with predatory lending. That was a big move by the legislature this legislative session. This is something that your organization has been working on for a number of years, reducing the size of that annual interest rate on the predatory lending. Can you give us an understanding of just how big of a reduction it is right now?
So right now in New Mexico, on small loans defined as loans up to $10,000, lenders can charge up to 175%. And that's why we call it predatory lending, because the interest rates are so high that it tends to entrap consumers into a cycle of debt. And so we brought it down in this legislation to 36% starting on January 1st.
Now, it doesn't take effect till January 1st of 2023, correct?
Correct.
Now, this is an issue that your organization has been working on for many years. Why do you think it took so long to really get this done?
Well, frankly, there was an army of lobbyists on the other side. I've been doing this work for about 3 decades. I've never seen so many lobbyists on one bill. And not just rank and file lobbyists. This was the former Speaker of the House, Raymond Sanchez, 3 retired legislators, 2 lobbyists who are married to current legislators. So it was sort of a who's who of the most effective and powerful lobbyists. And frankly, that was a lot to overcome.
Now, with this issue though, I mean, giving people the access to just having loans at credit unions or banks may be a problem in New Mexico in general. So what do you think needs to be addressed as well to help with this issue so folks may not turn to those loans where they may face high interest rates?
Yeah, I thought the best argument on the other side was the concern that if we were to bring these interest rates down, that people would lose access to credit. But as we came to find out, the credit unions in New Mexico, there's 145 branches right now, and they need to step up their marketing, but we're pretty confident that credit unions can pick up the slack of those predatory lenders who leave the state. Now, there are some of those lenders who can have a business model that works at 36%. So I'm not convinced, as some of the lobbyists on the other side said, that they're all going to leave the state. We've looked at other states that have brought down their very high interest rates to 36%, which seems to be sort of a national equilibrium. And in states like South Dakota and Illinois, many of those lenders stayed, but just brought their rates down to 36. I hope most low-income borrowers, however, will go to credit unions. The ones that are federally chartered, they can't charge more than 22%, and state chartered, I think, are 28%. So it really makes so much more sense to take these small loans out from credit unions.
Well, what about the folks in New Mexico who perhaps don't have enough of a credit history or enough credit established? Do you think that there may be some concerns with them going to a credit union or a bank and accessing credit if they don't have that established already?
I really don't think so. More and more credit unions aren't looking at your credit score. They ask questions like, would you be willing to take a financial literacy course as a prerequisite for this loan? And they find that that's much more indicative as to whether a borrower will repay that loan. And it's all to the good for the borrower to take a course like that.
How common is that, though? You go into a credit union or a bank and they ask you to take a financial literacy test instead of look at your credit score? How common is that?
It's actually pretty common. The interesting thing about credit unions is they were started just because of this problem. So going back about a century, when credit unions started spreading around the country, they were started by business people who were concerned that their employees were being taken advantage of by loan sharks. And that's why you see credit unions are organized usually by industry, because that's how they started. And they're also, a lot of people don't realize, they're nonprofits, and their mission isn't essentially to make money, but to make credit available. So they're very willing to lose money as a loss leader to teach financial literacy courses, because these customers become repeat customers and become very strong customers if they have those tools.
So what are your hopes with this bill taking effect at the start of next year? How do you think it's going to help folks in New Mexico?
So we believe this will be very, very positive, not just for the people who are borrowing money now, but for the state. And I'll tell you why. We had our interns look at I think there were 532 storefront lending stores when we started this effort. And we had the interns trace, what is the base? What is the headquarters of these companies? Invariably, they are located out of state. In fact, 89% are located out of New Mexico. So this is, Anthony, kind of like reverse economic development, in the sense that we're taking money and exporting it out of state. And just to give your viewers a sense of how much money we're talking about, in the last year that we have data from regulation and licensing, $666 million worth of loans were made. The vast majority of that goes out of state. Now, with the new law coming into effect and interest rates being brought down from 175% to 36%, that means borrowers will keep a lot more in their pockets. And because low-income people, who are the ones that take most of these loans, generally can't afford to save, that money is going to stay in New Mexico. They're going to spend it immediately, and most likely spend it on local businesses. And that will generate tax revenues and so forth, and help local businesses. So we think it's going to be a very positive development on many fronts, not just for the borrowers, but also for the business climate in New Mexico and for state government and local government that collects those gross receipts tax.
Okay, speaking of taxes, I want to move on to another issue, a big issue that your organization was working on for many years, the repeal of the state tax on Social Security in New Mexico. This was a controversial issue for a lot of folks for some time, but there was enough support to get this past the legislature this year. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that and the tax package that was signed by the governor. How do you think this is going to make a difference? Can you kind of give us an understanding, though, of just who is going to be impacted by the repeal of the state tax on Social Security?
Okay. So we came to this issue, we sort of stumbled across a statistic several years ago that 80%, almost 80% of New Mexico adults have $10,000 or less saved for their retirement. So, and your viewers probably most of them understand this, but Social Security was never designed to be your sole source of income in retirement. It was always designed to be a supplement. So we said, this is sort of a hidden crisis that's about to explode. We should do something about this. So we looked into different things we could do. And the most obvious was to simply repeal the tax on Social Security income that we've had in New Mexico since 1990. And because, you know, the program was designed to make sure that seniors have enough to survive in their retirement. And it just seemed counterproductive to tax what's supposed to be an income supplement. So who's it going to help? It's mostly going to help low and middle income New Mexicans. The tax kicks in at a very low level for individuals, about $25,000. And we think it's going to be obviously very beneficial for those people. It hits the entire middle class of New Mexico. And the way the bill was finally structured, some people say, well, don't repeal it because the state needs this income. And so a compromise was worked out so that it goes up to $150,000 for a couple, $100,000 for an individual. So that pretty much covers everybody in the middle class, including upper middle income people. But you know, we felt like this was a tax that never should have come into effect in the first place. No one deserves to be taxed twice on their income. So you're taxed when you earn the money. And then since 1990, when the legislature put this tax in, you're also taxed once you receive the benefits. And we just think that's counterproductive, again, in a state where so few have enough saved for their retirement. And one particular class that we talked about a lot was the 55,000 grandparents in New Mexico who are the guardians for their grandchildren, trying not to outlive their own retirement income while providing for their grandchildren. And I think when the governor signed the bill, she had somebody that was in that exact circumstance. And unfortunately in New Mexico, as I said, there are a lot of people in that situation, and it's just cruel to tax their Social Security income benefits. So we were delighted to see that tax repealed for those people under those levels. And I frankly would have supported just eradicating the whole tax. We're one of only a dozen states that has this tax. And of those states, we're tied, I believe, with Utah for the harshest tax, meaning it comes in at the lowest levels. So we continue to have the tax, but fortunately, it just falls on those people in the really highest income brackets.
Now, I imagine there has to be some supporters of this bill who are pretty excited about this tax being repealed for many New Mexicans due to rising prices happening at this time right now.
Yeah, it took us 3 years to get the tax repealed. I think it helped, frankly, that we are in this high inflationary environment and policymakers were looking for strategies to address it. And we said, well, look at this. I think it also, frankly, helped that it was an election year. And I think that was also a factor in getting some traction on it.
Okay, now I want to stay with this topic of retirement security because it's so important. Now, you brought up a statistic about so many folks having less than $10,000 saved for retirement. I'm thinking about this when I'm also thinking about your efforts to get some reform at the PARA board in New Mexico. I'd like to hear, your thoughts on this and why this reform is needed.
Yeah, that was a great question. So when we did this report on this hidden crisis of retirement security in New Mexico, we came up really with 3 recommendations, the obvious one being this: just take the tax off of Social Security income. And then we looked at private sector and public sector employees. And under public sector employees, we were just astonished. Well, let me start this way and say, the legislature did a great thing in 1947 when they created the Public Employees Retirement Association to create a pension system for public employees at both the local and state level. And for reasons I don't understand, they didn't require anybody on that board to have a background in finance or investments. Fast forward to 2022, and this board is overseeing a fund that's now grown to nearly $18 billion that covers nearly 100,000 New Mexicans. And nobody on this board is really trained in overseeing that. And so we found a study that was done by some researchers at Stanford that made some recommendations and made some comparisons about public pension boards. And we couldn't find any that didn't have at least one member who was required to have a background in investments and finance. So we think this is sort of the low-lying fruit. And we estimate, based on the Stanford study, that just raising the qualifications for this board and also removing elected officials. One of the fascinating things of the Stanford study was they looked at pension funds all across the United States and compared those with elected officials on the board and those without. And those without tended to perform about 100 basis points better. That's about 1%. 1% of $18 billion is $180 million. And that's a lot of money. And if you can get that compounded year after year, that will tend to improve performance. And this fund needs improvement. It's been in the bottom quartile of all public pension funds for the last decade. And then there's been an enormous amount of dysfunction on this board. If you go to Think New Mexico's website, we have a 7-minute archive where the board debated the quality of the snacks that they're being served by employees of the pension. Obviously not something they should be focused on. They should be focused on investment returns. They had a 45-minute debate over whether or not to approve a board agenda. Until recently, they couldn't agree on a person to be the board chair. So there's a lot of dysfunction that we think can be improved by upgrading the quality of who serves on that board and making sure, at a base level that they're qualified to be doing that job.
Okay, so you've worked with some senators on developing legislation to address this issue. How do you think it can really make an impact? And what's the problem with addressing this issue? How come this hasn't been addressed sooner with so many public employees in New Mexico and so many retired public employees in New Mexico?
Yeah, that's a real mystery. If you look at who's on that board and how they're elected, so they're all elected, but very few people tend to vote in those elections. So for the current employees, the turnout is less than 10%, going back many, many elections. The retired representatives, they do much better. There's about 30%. But that's not great. That means the majority of those represented don't even vote in these elections. And as you can imagine, they're low profile elections. People don't vote, I think, because they don't know who these people are. And the ones that tend to get elected are hyper political, frankly, and also tend to be from Albuquerque and Santa Fe because that's where most of the voters are. So currently on the board, there's no one from rural New Mexico. It is essentially, I think all but one are from Albuquerque. The other person is from Santa Fe. So another one of our arguments is that about half of these public employees, whether retired or current, are from rural parts of the state, and they have no representation. Now, the people on the inside, they like the system a great deal, and they like having control of it, and they're very political, and they know legislators, and they've been very effective, frankly, at getting to legislators and spinning tales of, a parade of horribles if we were to upgrade the qualifications of those who serve. And their argument is it would be anti-democratic to have these people appointed, which in many cases would make more sense. So that's where we are, but we're going to try again.
Okay, yeah, but I mean, just getting the issue of having people who are qualified to have updated qualifications with this, is it a little surprising this hasn't been addressed yet by state lawmakers?
I think it's really deeply troubling that it hasn't been addressed by lawmakers. But like I said, once again, there is a powerful army on the other side that's very well connected politically, and they've got the ear of legislators. But, and we need to do a better job, frankly, of telling the story. And the point that we really need to make to your viewers and others is this fund is underfunded right now. In other words, if it had to pay out tomorrow, it's about at 70%. Now, that would never happen. They would never have to pay out tomorrow or next Friday or next year. But still, you would want to see it closer to 100%, and it's not there. And if it drops much further, the legislature is going to have no choice but to backfill, and they would have to do that by going to taxpayers. And many of those taxpayers, Anthony, they don't have their own pension funds, and they would be forced to bail this program out. So we hope that legislators will take that into account and say, this fund is dangerously low on funds as it is, and it's time that we join with other pension funds and get some qualified people on this board. And we've initially we wanted everybody on the board to have a background in investments or finance, and there's plenty of public employees that have that background at DFA and the Legislative Finance Committee and so forth. You can find these people in every city and county government. But some people said, well, that's too elitist and other people won't be represented. So we've backed off of that, but still there's just this wall of opposition from the insiders who frankly control the system like right now and feel very comfortable with it.
Okay. I want to move on with another topic, and you've already spoken about this a little bit. We talked about some credit unions offering a personal finance course or test to potential borrowers, but you've been working on this issue with education and education reform efforts that your organization has been involved with in developing personal finance standards for courses for New Mexico students. Can you give us an understanding of what's really happening with this in K through 12 education?
Sure. Well, just to define terms for your viewers, so financial literacy is just teaching the basics of budgeting, of savings, how banks work, investing, and staying away from high-cost loans. In fact, that's how we came to this, is we noticed that more and more states were making this a requirement for high school graduation. I believe we're up to 24 states now, and 19 of those have done it in the last decade. And so we thought, well, this makes a lot of sense. Why don't we do this in New Mexico? We're never going to be this prosperous state that we all want us to become unless we give our citizenry the tools to deal with these financial questions about how to buy a car, how to save for college and so forth. So the good news is that Benicio Baldonado, who's our education reform director, devised a plan, and in the fall, the public education department was revising their high school social studies standards. And there was this big debate over how you teach history and critical race theory, et cetera. And Benicio started a letter writing campaign and generated hundreds of letters to PED to say, as long as you're opening up these standards, could you please include financial literacy? And the interesting thing was it brought together the proponents and the opponents of critical race theory, who's had very strong feelings on that, but they all agreed we definitely should incorporate financial literacy into our social studies standards. And the PED agreed. So now it's in the standards, but it's not a required course. In fact, it's an optional course, and only about 11% of current New Mexico students opt to take that course, naturally, we'd like to see it closer to 100%. We think everybody can benefit from it, whether you come from a low-income background or a more privileged background. Everybody can use this information. And I've sat in on some of these classes where it is taught. Recently, I went to a charter school here in Santa Fe called Echo. And the interesting thing that I discovered, well, first of all, I polled the students and their teacher was there, so that might have affected their responses. But the overwhelming response was, this is very relevant to my life. And so much of what I learned in school doesn't seem to be all that relevant. And when you look at the data as to why kids drop out, that's the number one reason. I'm not learning things that are relevant to my life. So it's good to keep these kids in class. The other thing is it's an anti-poverty strategy. And a lot of these kids will take what they learn in a financial literacy course and bring it home and help their grandparents or their parents or siblings with these issues. So it's something we desperately need in New Mexico, and we're optimistic with the help of some legislators that we might be able to get it passed in the 2023 session, when the legislature is already planning to revamp the requirements for high school graduation.
I see. Unfortunately, we're out of time, Fred, but I want to thank you so much for joining us. Fred Nathan is founder and executive director of Think New Mexico. Again, thank you for joining us for the program, Fred.
Thank you again, Anthony. Thank you for having me back.
That's our time for now. You can join us this week on KRWG Radio every weekday. It's morning edition from 5 to 9, fresh air at 11, followed by Here and Now at noon. And All Things Considered every weekday from 4 to 7 p.m. KRWG News is online at krwg.org. And remember, we always want to hear from you. You can email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Anthony Morneau. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.